Jacob Mercer gave his last bag of feed for a dying horse everyone said would be dead by morning. The thieves who'd beaten and starved her to hide a $5 million secret arrived 3 nights later with guns and an offer he couldn't accept. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The last of Jacob Mercer's money disappeared on a Tuesday morning when the feed store owner, old Carl Henderson, informed him that prices had gone up again. Jacob stood at the counter with his worn hat in his hands, staring at the pitiful collection of coins he had managed to scrape together from doing odd jobs around Willow Creek. It wasn't enough. Not nearly enough to feed his 2 remaining horses through the coming winter, and certainly not enough to keep his small piece of rented land from slipping through his fingers like water through a sieve. At 28 years old, Jacob had already experienced more failure than most men twice his age. His father's ranch had been lost to drought and debt 3 years ago, taking with it not just the family legacy, but Jacob's dreams of becoming a successful cattleman like his grandfather before him. Since then, he had been scraping by on whatever work he could find, breaking horses for other men, mending fences, hauling supplies, anything that would keep him fed and provide shelter for the 2 aging quarter horses that were all he had left of his father's once proud herd. The morning sun streamed through the feed store's dusty windows, illuminating particles that danced in the air like tiny specks of lost hope. Jacob counted his coins again, though he already knew the sum by heart: $3.47. The feed he needed cost $8 minimum, and that was for the cheapest grade, the kind that was more chaff than nutrition. Carl Henderson watched him with a mixture of pity and impatience. The feed store owner was a decent man, but he had his own bills to pay, his own family to feed. He couldn't afford to extend credit to every down-on-his-luck cowboy who walked through his door, no matter how much he might sympathize with their situations. Times were hard for everyone in the Montana Territory, and charity was a luxury few could afford. Jacob felt the familiar burn of shame in his chest as he gathered his coins and prepared to leave empty-handed. He would have to figure something else out. Maybe try to find work at one of the larger ranches, though most of them had stopped hiring weeks ago as autumn turned toward winter. Perhaps he could convince the landlord to let him work off his rent by doing repairs on the property, buy himself a few more weeks to come up with a solution. As he turned to go, a commotion outside caught his attention. Through the window he could see a crowd gathering in the street, their voices rising in that peculiar mixture of curiosity and judgment that small towns specialized in. Jacob pushed through the door and stepped onto the wooden sidewalk, his eyes adjusting to the brighter light as he tried to make sense of what had drawn such attention. A traveling horse trader named Silas McKnight had arrived in town, his wagon piled high with tack and equipment, and behind him on a lead rope was the sorriest-looking draft horse Jacob had ever seen. The animal was massive, easily 18 hands tall, with the characteristic thick legs and broad chest of a Belgian breed. But where a healthy draft horse should have displayed strength and vitality, this creature looked like death barely postponed. Its coat was dull and patchy, ribs visible beneath skin that seemed to hang loose on its enormous frame. One eye was clouded with what looked like an old injury, and it moved with a pronounced limp that suggested serious problems with its left rear leg. The crowd's comments were predictably cruel. Someone laughed and called it a glue factory candidate. Another voice suggested McKnight should put the poor beast out of its misery, rather than parading it through town like some kind of sick joke. The trader, a wiry man with calculating eyes and a smile that never quite reached them, was putting on a show, trying to drum up interest in his other merchandise by using the pathetic draft horse as a spectacle. Jacob found himself moving closer, drawn by something he couldn't quite name. He had always had a soft spot for animals, particularly horses, and the sight of this magnificent creature reduced to such a pitiful state stirred something protective in him. As he approached, the draft horse's good eye found his, and Jacob felt an unexpected jolt of connection. There was intelligence in that gaze, and beneath the obvious suffering something else. Pride, perhaps, or determination. The look of a creature that had not entirely given up despite circumstances that would have broken lesser animals. Silas McKnight noticed Jacob's interest immediately, the way a predator notices movement in the periphery. He sidled over with that insincere smile plastered across his weathered face, already launching into his pitch before Jacob could think of retreating. The trader explained that he had won the horse in a card game from a farmer whose spread had gone under. The beast was supposedly trained for heavy pulling work, though McKnight admitted with a theatrical sigh that its current condition made it worthless for any practical purpose. He was planning to sell it to the rendering plant in the next town over, but if Jacob was interested, well, he might be persuaded to part with it for a nominal sum. Jacob knew he was being played. He could recognize a con artist's tactics from experience, having been swindled more than once in his younger, more naive days. But something about the horse called to him, tugged at his conscience in a way he couldn't ignore. This animal deserved better than to end its days in a rendering plant, reduced to glue and dog food. There was something noble about it despite its wretched condition, something that reminded Jacob of his own circumstances, beaten down by life, but not yet completely defeated. The absurdity of his situation wasn't lost on him. Here he stood, a man who couldn't afford to feed the horses he already had, contemplating taking on another mouth to feed, and not just any horse, but a supposedly useless draft animal that looked like it might not survive another month. It was the height of foolishness, the kind of impractical sentimentality that had contributed to his current desperate circumstances. His father would have called it poor judgment. His mother would have said his heart was too soft for the harsh realities of frontier life, but as Jacob looked into that intelligent eye, as he saw the way the horse held itself despite obvious pain and malnutrition, he made a decision that defied all logic and common sense. He turned to Silas McKnight and asked how much the trader wanted for the animal. McKnight's eyes lit up with the unmistakable gleam of a man who had just hooked a desperate fish. He stroked his stubbled chin thoughtfully, as if he were actually considering the value of an animal he had already declared worthless moments before. The performance was almost insulting in its transparency, but Jacob waited patiently, knowing that showing too much interest would only drive up whatever ridiculous price the trader was about to name. $20, McKnight announced finally, as if he were offering Jacob the deal of the century. The horse might not look like much now, but with proper care and feeding, well, you never know what might be possible. It's got good breeding, you can see that in the bone structure. Just needs someone with the time and resources to bring it back to health. The crowd around them had grown, drawn by the spectacle of what they clearly saw as two fools negotiating over a worthless animal. Jacob could hear their whispered commentary, the snickers and headshakes of people who thought they knew better. Old Man Patterson, who owned the general store, muttered something about throwing good money after bad. Mrs. Winters, the banker's wife, tisked loudly about the poor judgment of young men who let emotion override common sense. Jacob ignored them all, his attention focused entirely on the trader and the horse. $20 was absurd, insulting even, for an animal in such condition. It was also $19.97 more than he had in his pocket. The feed he couldn't afford was $8. The rent he owed on his small plot of land was another $12. Even if he had $20 to spare, which he emphatically did not, spending it on this broken-down draft horse would be financial suicide. "I don't have $20, Jacob said flatly, deciding that honesty was his only real option at this point. "I have a bag of feed back at my place, about 50 pounds of good quality oats and grain. I was saving it for my own horses, but I'll trade it for the draft horse." The crowd's laughter was immediate and loud. Someone called out that he was crazy, that he was trading away his own animal's food for a creature that would probably die within the week. McKnight's expression shifted from predatory interest to calculating assessment. 50 pounds of feed was worth maybe $5 or $6 at current prices, hardly the 20 he had asked for. But Jacob could see the wheels turning behind the trader's eyes. McKnight was scheduled to leave town that afternoon, heading north to the next settlement. Taking the draft horse with him meant paying for its keep, however minimal, and dealing with the inevitable complaints about the eyesore he was transporting. Leaving it behind meant finding someone willing to pay the rendering plant's fee, which would eat into whatever small profit he might make. The trader's smile turned genuine, or at least more genuine than his previous expressions. "Make it 2 bags of feed and you've got yourself a deal." Jacob felt his jaw tighten. "I told you I only have 1 bag, and that's all my other horses have to last them until I can find more work. But I'll throw in 2 days of labor. I'm good with my hands, can fix just about anything that needs fixing, and I'll help you load your wagon and prepare it for travel." McKnight studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. The crowd had gone quieter now, sensing that actual negotiation was taking place, curious to see how this bizarre transaction would resolve itself. Finally, the trader spat into his palm and extended his hand. 1 bag of feed and 1 day's labor. "Help me get my wagon ready to leave today, and the horse is yours." Jacob shook the offered hand, sealing what was quite possibly the worst deal he had ever made in his life. The crowd dispersed quickly, their entertainment concluded, most of them shaking their heads at the foolishness they had just witnessed. Carl Henderson, who had followed Jacob out of the feed store, approached with concern written across his weathered features. "Son," he said quietly, "I've known you since you were knee-high to a grasshopper, knew your father too. This is a mistake. That animal is going to eat you out of house and home before winter's even properly started, and from the look of it, you'll be burying it before spring thaw." Jacob nodded, accepting the older man's concern as the genuine worry it was. "You're probably right, Carl, but I couldn't stand by and watch it go to the rendering plant. Sometimes you have to do something, even if it's foolish, just because it's the right thing." "The right thing doesn't keep you fed or sheltered," the feed store owner replied, but there was a note of resignation in his voice, as if he recognized that Jacob's mind was made up, and further argument would be pointless. Jacob spent the next several hours helping Silas McKnight prepare for departure. He loaded heavy equipment onto the wagon, reorganized the trader's goods for better weight distribution, and repaired a cracked wheel spoke that would have likely failed within the first few miles of travel. McKnight watched him work with grudging respect, occasionally offering comments about various horses he had traded over the years, stories that were probably half lies but entertaining nonetheless. When the work was finally done and the wagon ready to roll, Jacob returned to his small rented property on the outskirts of town. The 2 quarter horses he owned, both in their late teens and showing their age, greeted him with friendly nickers from their modest corral. They were good animals, loyal and hardworking, and the guilt of what he was about to do sat heavy in his chest. The single bag of feed he had been carefully rationing to make it last as long as possible was stored in the small shed that served as his barn. It represented security, the knowledge that his animals would eat for at least another week or 2 while he searched for work. He hefted the bag onto his shoulder, feeling its weight both physically and metaphorically, as he walked back toward town, toward the trader who was waiting with that pathetic draft horse. Jacob tried to convince himself that he wasn't making the biggest mistake of his already mistake-filled life. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold that reminded him of better times, of his father's ranch when it had been prosperous, when the future had seemed full of promise rather than perpetual struggle. McKnight was smoking a cigarette by his wagon when Jacob arrived, the draft horse still tied nearby, its head hanging low with exhaustion. The trader took the feed bag with satisfaction, testing its weight and nodding approval. "She's all yours," he said, gesturing to the horse. "Good luck with whatever you think you're going to do with her." As the wagon rolled away, leaving Jacob standing in the dusty street with his new acquisition, the full reality of his situation crashed down upon him. He had just traded away his security, his safety net, for an animal that might very well die despite his best efforts. The rational part of his mind screamed that he had been a fool, that sentiment and compassion were luxuries a man in his position could not afford. The walk back to his property with the draft horse was slow and painful to witness. The animal could barely manage more than a shuffling limp, its breathing labored from the minimal exertion. Jacob kept the lead rope loose, allowing the horse to set its own pace, speaking to it in the low, calm voice his father had taught him to use with frightened or injured animals. Several times they had to stop completely while the horse gathered its strength, standing with its head lowered, sides heaving with effort that should have been unnecessary for such a short distance. The sun was beginning to set by the time they finally reached Jacob's modest homestead. The 2-quarter horses came to the fence line immediately, their ears pricked forward with curiosity at this enormous newcomer. Jacob led the draft horse to a small paddock he rarely used, separated from the main corral by a weathered wooden fence. The last thing he needed was his healthy horses catching whatever illness or parasites this poor creature might be carrying. He filled a bucket with fresh water from the well, watching as the draft horse drank with desperate thirst, its muzzle submerging completely as it gulped the cool liquid. When it finally raised its head, water dripping from its whiskers, Jacob got his first really close look at the animal in proper light. What he saw made his heart sink even further. This wasn't just malnutrition and neglect. The horse's teeth, when he gently examined its mouth, showed signs of severe wear and improper care. Its hooves were cracked and overgrown, the left rear one especially damaged, which explained the pronounced limp. There were old scars crisscrossing its hide, evidence of harsh treatment or accidents, and the clouded eye looked like it had been injured months or even years ago without proper veterinary attention. Jacob sat on the fence rail as darkness fell, watching the draft horse explore its new surroundings with cautious, painful steps. He had no feed to give it tonight, having traded away his only bag. In the morning, he would have to figure out something, maybe see if he could barter work for hay or grain, or perhaps find wild grass that hadn't yet been killed by early frost. The whole situation felt overwhelming, impossible, a problem without any reasonable solution. That night, lying in his small, drafty cabin, Jacob couldn't sleep. His mind kept returning to the horse, to its suffering, to the impossible task he had set for himself. He had saved it from the rendering plant, but for what? A slower death by starvation? He had no money, no prospects, and now 3 horses to feed instead of 2. The mathematics of his situation were brutally simple. He was going to fail. The only question was how catastrophically and how soon. When dawn finally broke, painting the sky in shades of pearl and rose, Jacob forced himself out of bed and went to check on his new acquisition. What he found stopped him in his tracks. The draft horse was standing in the center of the small paddock, and something about its posture had changed overnight. Its head was raised higher than it had been yesterday, and when it turned to look at him, there was alertness in its good eye that hadn't been there before. The simple act of being given water, shelter, and a safe place to rest had already begun to work some small miracle of recovery. Jacob approached slowly, speaking softly, and was surprised when the horse actually took a tentative step toward him, rather than away. He ran his hands along its neck, feeling the bones too prominent beneath the skin, but also sensing the powerful muscle structure that lay dormant beneath the neglect. This had been a magnificent animal once, he realized. A working horse of exceptional quality, broken down by circumstances and cruelty, but not entirely destroyed. As his hands moved across the horse's body, checking for injuries and assessing its overall condition in better light, his fingers encountered something unexpected. Beneath the matted hair on the left shoulder, partially hidden by dirt and the animal's poor coat condition, was what felt like a brand mark. But it wasn't the simple ranch brand he expected. This was more complex, more deliberate. He fetched a brush and bucket of water, gently cleaning the area until he could see what had been hidden. The mark was unusual, almost artistic in its execution. It showed what appeared to be a crowned shield with intricate details that suggested this was no ordinary ranch identification. Jacob had seen enough livestock brands in his years around horses and cattle to know that this was something different, something significant. The craftsmanship alone spoke of wealth and importance, the kind of marking that belonged on valuable breeding stock or animals of exceptional pedigree. His heart began to beat faster as possibilities started forming in his mind. What if this horse wasn't just a broken-down draft animal that some farmer had lost in a card game? What if there was more to its story, a history that explained both its current pitiful condition and the intelligent awareness he had sensed from the beginning? The brand suggested breeding, quality, value that went beyond simple working horse utility. Jacob knew he needed help, someone who understood brands and pedigrees better than he did. Doc Hartley, the veterinarian who served the scattered ranches around Willow Creek, would be his best option. But Doc's services cost money that Jacob didn't have. Still, perhaps he could convince the old veterinarian to at least look at the brand, to offer an opinion about what it might signify. It was a slim hope, but it was more hope than he had felt since making his impulsive trade yesterday. He spent the morning doing what he could for the draft horse with the limited resources available. He trimmed the overgrown hooves as best he could, though the left rear one was so damaged that he feared permanent lameness. He cleaned wounds that had been neglected for too long, applied what little salve he had left from treating his own horses, and fashioned a makeshift poultice for the clouded eye, though he doubted it would do much good for an injury so old. The quarter horses watched these proceedings with interest, occasionally nickering as if offering encouragement, or perhaps questioning their owner's sanity. Jacob understood their confusion. He was questioning his own sanity quite thoroughly. Here he was, spending his precious time and resources on an animal that any reasonable person would have let go to its fate. But something kept him working, kept him hoping that maybe, just maybe, there was more to this situation than met the eye. By midday, he had made the decision to walk into town and find Doc Hartley, regardless of whether he could pay for the consultation. Doc Hartley's office occupied a small building behind the livery stable, a practical location that allowed the veterinarian easy access to the animals he treated most frequently. The structure smelled of liniment, leather, and the sharp tang of medicinal compounds that Jacob associated with healing and hope. He found the old veterinarian bent over a workbench, mixing some concoction in a glass beaker with the careful attention of a chemist rather than a frontier animal doctor. The veterinarian looked up as Jacob entered, his weathered face breaking into a smile that quickly faded to concern when he saw the younger man's expression. "Jacob Mercer," he said, straightening up and wiping his hands on his apron. "I heard about your questionable business transaction yesterday. Half the town's talking about the fool cowboy who traded his horse feed for a dying draft animal." Jacob felt heat rise in his cheeks, but held his ground. "Doc, I need your help. I need you to look at something, and I need your honest opinion about what it might mean. I can't pay you right now, but I'll work off whatever I owe. I'm good for it." The old veterinarian studied him for a long moment, his sharp eyes taking in Jacob's earnest expression, the desperation barely hidden beneath his pride. "When have I ever charged you for advice, boy? Come on, let's see this mysterious something that's got you so worked up." The walk back to Jacob's property was filled with conversation. Doc Hartley had known Jacob's father, had tended the Mercer family's horses for years before drought and debt had destroyed everything. He spoke fondly of those earlier times, of Jacob as a boy showing natural talent with animals, of the high hopes everyone had held for the Mercer ranch's future, The reminiscence was bittersweet, a reminder of everything that had been lost, but also of the foundation that had shaped Jacob into the man he was, for better or worse. When they arrived at the small paddock where the draft horse stood, Doc Hartley stopped in his tracks. His expression shifted from casual interest to focused attention, the look of a professional encountering something unexpected. He approached the fence slowly, his movements careful and deliberate, and Jacob noticed that the veterinarian's hands had begun to tremble slightly. "May I?" Doc asked, indicating he wanted to enter the paddock. Jacob nodded, opening the gate and watching as the old man approached the draft horse with a reverence that seemed out of place for an animal in such poor condition. The horse, for its part, stood calmly, as if sensing that this human meant no harm. Doc Hartley's hands moved over the horse's body with practiced expertise, checking bone structure, muscle development, the overall conformation beneath the obvious neglect. He examined the hooves, running his fingers along the lines and angles with a thoroughness that spoke of deep knowledge. He looked at teeth, eyes, the set of the ears, every detail cataloged and assessed with professional precision. Then Jacob showed him the brand. Doc Hartley cleaned the area even more thoroughly than Jacob had, using water and soft cloths he had brought in his medical bag. As the full detail of the mark became visible, the veterinarian went completely still. His face had gone pale, and when he finally looked up at Jacob, there was something like awe in his expression. "Do you know what this is?" Doc asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "This brand, do you have any idea what it signifies?" Jacob shook his head, his heart pounding with anticipation and a growing sense that his impulsive trade might have been less foolish than everyone thought. "That's why I came to you, Doc. I've never seen anything like it." The veterinarian took a deep breath, as if steadying himself before delivering news of tremendous importance. "This brand belongs to the Blackwood Stables of Kentucky. They're one of the most prestigious breeding operations in the entire country, known for producing draft horses of exceptional quality and bloodline. Their animals sell for thousands of dollars, sometimes tens of thousands for breeding stock." Jacob felt the world tilt beneath him. Thousands of dollars. That couldn't be right. This broken-down, half-starved animal that he had acquired for a bag of feed and a day's labor. It was impossible, some kind of mistake or misunderstanding. But Doc Hartley was shaking his head, his expression grave. "I'm not mistaken, Jacob. I've seen this brand before years ago when I was studying veterinary medicine in the East. Blackwood Stables doesn't mark just any horse with their crown shield. This animal is registered breeding stock, descended from champion bloodlines that go back generations. How did it end up here in this condition being traded by a horse dealer for practically nothing?" Jacob asked, his mind reeling with implications he was only beginning to grasp. "That's the question, isn't it?" Doc replied, still running his hands over the horse's body, his professional assessment continuing even as they talked. "My guess would be theft, or perhaps the horse was lost or stolen during transport. These animals don't simply disappear from operations like Blackwood Stables without someone noticing, without someone searching." Jacob felt a cold knot of fear forming in his stomach. If the horse was stolen, did that make him complicit in the theft? Could he be accused of receiving stolen property? His already precarious situation suddenly seemed to have become exponentially more complicated and dangerous. The veterinarian seemed to read his thoughts. "Don't panic yet. Let me examine this animal more thoroughly. Check for any additional identification or marks that might tell us more of the story. And Jacob, this mare needs immediate medical attention regardless of her value or history. She's malnourished, injured, and probably suffering from various parasites and infections. Without proper care, she won't survive another month." "Mare," Jacob repeated, suddenly realizing he had been thinking of the horse as gender neutral, another oversight in his hasty acquisition. Doc Hartley nodded, continuing his examination with increased purpose. The old veterinarian spent the next hour conducting a thorough assessment, occasionally making notes in a small leather journal he kept in his bag. He cleaned wounds, examined the damaged eye more carefully, and paid particular attention to the injured rear leg. His expression grew increasingly serious as the examination progressed, and Jacob found himself holding his breath, waiting for the verdict. Finally, Doc Hartley straightened up, his back creaking with the effort. The good news is that most of this damage is reversible with proper nutrition, care, and time. The bad news is that proper care is going to cost money you don't have, and time is something this mare may not have much of unless we act quickly. What about her leg? Jacob asked, fear evident in his voice. Will she be permanently lame? The veterinarian considered the question carefully. The hoof damage is severe, but I've seen worse cases recover. It will require specialized shoeing, regular treatment, and possibly some corrective work. As for the lameness, I think much of it is due to pain and weakness rather than permanent structural damage. Get her healthy, get proper shoes on her, and I believe she'll walk sound again. Jacob looked at the mare with new eyes, trying to see past the suffering and neglect to the valuable animal Doc Hartley claimed she was. It seemed impossible that this creature, which he had acquired for practically nothing, could be worth the kind of money the veterinarian was suggesting. Yet there was the brand, undeniable proof of origins that spoke of breeding and quality beyond anything Jacob had ever owned or likely ever would own under normal circumstances. What do I do, Doc? He asked quietly. If she's stolen property, don't I have an obligation to return her? And even if she's not, how can I possibly afford the care she needs? I'm barely keeping myself fed, let alone 3 horses. Doc Hartley closed his medical bag with a decisive snap, his expression thoughtful. First things first. We need to get her stable and healthy enough that she's not in immediate danger of dying. As for the legal questions, those can wait until we know more. Let me do some research, send some telegrams to contacts I have back east. If this mare went missing from Blackwood Stables, there will be records, possibly even a reward for information leading to her recovery. The mention of a reward sent a jolt of hope through Jacob's chest, quickly followed by guilt. Was it wrong to hope for financial gain from an animal's suffering? But then again, if caring for this mare properly was going to cost him money he didn't have, perhaps a reward would simply balance the scales, make it possible for him to do the right thing without destroying himself financially in the process. For now, Doc continued, I'm going to leave you with some medicines and instructions. I've got some feed I can spare, enough to get you through a few days. You'll need to give her small amounts frequently, rather than large meals. Her digestive system needs to adjust gradually to proper nutrition after prolonged starvation. And Jacob, his tone became serious. Don't tell anyone else about that brand. Not yet. If this mare is as valuable as I think she is, and word gets out, you might find yourself dealing with some very unpleasant characters. The warning sent a chill down Jacob's spine. He hadn't considered that aspect of the situation. Silas McKnight, the horse trader who had sold him the mare, where had he really gotten her? If she had been stolen, was McKnight the thief, or had he acquired her from someone else? Either way, if word spread that Jacob Mercer was in possession of a potentially valuable stolen animal, his already difficult life could become actively dangerous. Doc Hartley spent another hour showing Jacob the proper way to administer the medicines he was leaving, explaining the feeding schedule, and demonstrating how to clean and treat the various wounds and injuries. The old veterinarian worked with the patience of a teacher, making sure Jacob understood not just what to do, but why each step mattered. It reminded Jacob of his father's teaching methods, the way he had taken time to explain the reasoning behind ranch work rather than simply demanding obedience. As the sun began its descent toward evening, Doc Hartley prepared to leave. He paused at the gate, looking back at Jacob and the mare with an expression that mixed concern with something else, perhaps a reflection of his own younger days when the world had seemed full of impossible challenges. "You're a good man, Jacob Mercer," he said quietly. "Your father would be proud of how you've handled yourself since losing the ranch. This mare couldn't have found a better owner, even if the circumstances are complicated." The words, meant as comfort, instead brought a lump to Jacob's throat. His father's pride had been a driving force in his life, and losing the ranch had felt like the ultimate betrayal of that legacy. To hear that someone still thought well of him, still saw worth in his character despite his failures, meant more than he could easily express. After Doc Hartley left, Jacob set about following the veterinarian's instructions with methodical care. He prepared a small portion of the feed Doc had provided, mixing it with water to create a mash that would be easier for the mare to digest. He watched as she ate slowly, carefully, her good eye occasionally turning to look at him as if in gratitude or perhaps simple acknowledgement of his presence. The evening air was growing cool, autumn asserting itself with the promise of coming winter. Jacob fetched an old blanket from his cabin, threadbare and worn but still capable of providing some warmth, and draped it carefully over the mare's back. She stood calmly as he adjusted it, seeming to understand that this was care rather than constraint. As darkness fell and stars began to appear in the vast Montana sky, Jacob found himself sitting on the fence rail again, watching his 3 horses settle in for the night. The 2 quarter horses were already dozing in their corral, hip-shot and relaxed in the way of animals that felt safe and content. The mare stood in her separate paddock, the blanket making her look slightly less skeletal, her head lowered but not with the defeated exhaustion of yesterday. There was something peaceful about her posture now, something that suggested she was beginning to trust that this place, this human, meant her no harm. Jacob's mind wandered through the tangled web of questions and possibilities that had suddenly complicated his life. If the mare was indeed valuable breeding stock from a prestigious operation like Blackwood Stables, how had she ended up in such terrible condition? The journey from Kentucky to Montana was substantial, and somewhere along that path, this animal had gone from pampered breeding stock to abused and neglected draft horse being traded by a suspicious horse dealer. He thought about Silas McKnight's story of winning the horse in a card game from a farmer whose spread had gone under. Had that been true, or simply a convenient lie? If there was a chain of ownership between Blackwood Stables and McKnight, how many hands had this mare passed through, and what had each done to contribute to her current state? The legal implications troubled him deeply. In the eyes of the law, he had purchased the mare in good faith from someone who claimed to own her. But if she was stolen property, did his ignorance of that fact protect him? Could someone arrive tomorrow with proof of ownership and simply take her away, leaving him with nothing but the loss of his feed bag and a day's labor? Worse still was the thought that returning the mare to her rightful owners, assuming Doc Hartley could locate them, might result in her being shipped back east in her current fragile condition. The journey could kill her. She needed weeks, possibly months of careful recovery before she would be strong enough to handle that kind of stress. These thoughts churned through his mind as the night deepened and the temperature dropped. Eventually, cold and exhaustion drove him inside to his cabin, but sleep was elusive. He found himself getting up multiple times to check on the mare, to make sure she was still standing, still breathing, still holding on to the life he was trying so desperately to help her reclaim. The following days settled into a rhythm that consumed Jacob's every waking hour. He rose before dawn to prepare the mare's first small meal, mixing the precious feed Doc Hartley had provided with warm water to make it easier to digest. He administered medicines with careful precision, cleaned wounds that were slowly beginning to show signs of healing, and spent long hours simply sitting near the paddock, talking to her in the low, soothing voice that seemed to calm her. The mare began to respond to his care in ways that surprised him. By the 3rd day, she would walk to the fence when he approached, nickering softly and greeting. Her good eye had developed a brightness that spoke of returning vitality, and though she was still painfully thin, the desperate edge of starvation was beginning to fade. She allowed him to handle her injured leg without resistance, seeming to understand that the treatments, though sometimes uncomfortable, were meant to help. Jacob named her Duchess, a title that seemed appropriate for an animal of such supposedly noble lineage. The name felt right somehow, dignified without being pretentious, acknowledging what she might have been while respecting what she had become through suffering and survival. His 2 quarter horses, curious about the new addition, would often stand at the fence separating the paddocks, watching Duchess with interest. Jacob noticed that the mare seemed drawn to their company, positioning herself as close to them as the fence allowed. There was something poignant about her obvious desire for connection with her own kind, after what must have been a long period of isolation and mistreatment. On the 4th day, Doc Hartley returned with news. He carried a telegram in his hand, his expression grave as he entered Jacob's property. The veterinarian's usual composure seemed shaken, and Jacob felt his stomach tighten with anticipation of whatever information had arrived from back east. "I heard back from my contacts at several veterinary colleges and breeding associations," Doc said without preamble. "Jacob, this mare isn't just from Blackwood Stables. According to the records I was able to access, she's one of their foundation breeding mares. Her registered name is Blackwood Sovereign Duchess, and her bloodline is directly descended from some of the finest Belgian draft horses ever imported to America." Jacob stared at the telegram, though the technical details written there meant little to him. What does that mean exactly? In terms of value, in terms of what happens next? Doc Hartley's expression was troubled. In terms of value, if she were in proper condition and available for sale, she would be worth somewhere between $5,000 and $10,000, possibly more to the right buyer. Breeding rights alone would command substantial fees. But there's more, and this is where things get complicated. According to my sources, this mare was reported stolen 18 months ago from a breeding facility in Ohio, where she had been on loan for a breeding program. 18 months. Jacob's mind reeled at the timeline. She's been missing for 1.5 years, and in that time, she went from valuable breeding stock to the broken animal I found. The transformation suggests a deliberate effort to disguise her identity and value, Doc replied. Someone knew what they had stolen and went to great lengths to make her unrecognizable. The brand could be hidden by poor coat condition and dirt. Her conformation and breeding could be obscured by starvation and neglect. If you hadn't cleaned her shoulder, if I hadn't recognized that specific brand, she might have ended up as dog food without anyone being the wiser. The calculated cruelty of it made Jacob feel sick. Someone had stolen this magnificent animal and then systematically destroyed her health and appearance to avoid detection. The abuse wasn't just neglect born of poverty or ignorance. It was intentional, methodical, designed to erase her identity and value. "What about reward money?" Jacob asked, feeling mercenary even as the question left his lips. "You mentioned there might be a reward for information." Doc Hartley nodded slowly. Blackwood Stables posted a reward of $500 for information leading to her recovery. But Jacob, and here his tone became even more serious, "There's a problem. The telegram I received also contained a warning. Apparently the theft was part of a larger operation. Several valuable horses went missing around the same time, and there's evidence suggesting organized crime involvement. Whoever stole Duchess might still be looking for her, and they won't be happy to learn she's been found." The warning landed like a physical blow. Jacob thought about Silas McKnight, the traveling horse trader who had seemed so eager to unload the mare. Had he been part of the theft, or simply an unlucky middleman who had acquired stolen property without knowing its true value? Either way, if McKnight learned that the supposedly worthless draft horse he'd traded for a bag of feed was actually worth thousands of dollars, he might try to reclaim her through legal means or otherwise. "What do I do?" Jacob asked, feeling overwhelmed by circumstances spiraling far beyond his control. Do I contact Blackwood Stables directly? Do I go to the local sheriff? Doc Hartley was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the ethical and practical implications of the situation. Here's what I think, he said finally. First, we keep this information between ourselves for now. The sheriff in Willow Creek is a good man, but he's also not equipped to deal with organized horse theft rings. Second, we continue nursing Duchess back to health. She's in no condition to travel anywhere, and sending her back to Kentucky in her current state would likely kill her. Third, I'm going to send a carefully worded telegram to Blackwood Stables, letting them know that a mare matching their missing animal's description has been located, but requiring confirmation of identity before revealing specifics. And fourth, Jacob prompted, sensing there was more to the veterinarian's plan. Fourth, you need to be very careful. Don't talk about this mare with anyone in town. Keep her out of sight as much as possible. If McKnight or his associates come looking, you know nothing beyond the fact that you bought a draft horse in poor condition and have been nursing it back to health. The brand, her potential value, all of that stays between us until we have a clearer picture of the situation. Jacob nodded, understanding the wisdom of caution even as he chafed against the secrecy. He was an honest man by nature, uncomfortable with deception even when it served a greater good. But the thought of Duchess being reclaimed by thieves, or worse, being hurt because he had been careless with information, overrode his discomfort. The two men spent the next hour examining Duchess together, with Doc Hartley making detailed notes about her current condition and the progress she had made over the past few days. The veterinarian's professional assessment was cautiously optimistic. She was responding well to treatment, gaining strength gradually, showing signs of the robust health she must have possessed before being stolen and abused. Over the following week, Jacob threw himself into Duchess's care with single-minded devotion. He had always been good with horses, but this felt different, more personal somehow. Every small improvement in her condition felt like a victory against the cruelty and neglect she had endured. When she took her first steps without limping, when her coat began to show hints of the rich chestnut color it should have been, when she nickered at the sound of his voice, he felt a pride and satisfaction that had been absent from his life for far too long. The financial reality of his situation remained dire. The feed Doc Hartley had provided was running low, and Jacob still had no steady source of income. He took on whatever odd jobs he could find around Willow Creek, mucking stalls, repairing fences, hauling supplies, anything that would earn him enough to buy feed for his 3 horses. The work was exhausting and paid poorly, but it kept them all fed, barely. His landlord, a hard man named Garrett, who owned several properties around town, came by one evening to collect rent that Jacob didn't have. The confrontation was brief and unpleasant, with Garrett making it clear that Jacob had one more week to come up with the money or he would be evicted from the property. The threat hung over Jacob like a dark cloud, adding urgency to an already desperate situation. That night, sitting outside his cabin with a cup of weak coffee, Jacob considered his options. He could try to find work at one of the larger ranches, but that would mean leaving his horses unsupervised, and given Duchess's value and the potential danger surrounding her, that seemed impossibly risky. He could try to borrow money, but from whom? He had no collateral, no prospects that would convince anyone to take that risk. The reward money from Blackwood Stables would solve everything, but Doc Hartley had warned that it might take weeks to verify Duchess's identity and arrange payment. A sound from Duchess's paddock drew his attention. She was standing at the fence, her head raised, ears pricked forward in alert attention. Something had caught her interest, and as Jacob rose to investigate, he heard what she had already detected, the sound of horses approaching in the darkness. 2 riders emerged from the shadows, their faces obscured by the dim light from Jacob's cabin. He felt his heart rate quicken, his hand instinctively moving toward the rifle he kept by the door. In this part of Montana, unexpected visitors after dark rarely brought good news. "Evening," one of the riders called out, his voice carrying an accent that Jacob couldn't quite place. "We're looking for Jacob Mercer. That would be you, I'm guessing." Jacob moved into the better light from his cabin, making sure the riders could see he was armed, but not actively threatening. "That's me. What can I do for you, gentlemen?" The speaker dismounted, his companion remaining on horseback, positioned in a way that suggested they had experience with situations that might turn dangerous. The man who approached was tall and lean, dressed in clothes that marked him as someone with money, not a common ranch hand or drifter. His eyes, even in the poor light, held a calculating intelligence that made Jacob immediately wary. "My name is Clayton Morse," the man said, not offering his hand. "I represent certain business interests that occasionally deal in livestock acquisition. I understand you recently came into possession of a rather large draft horse, traded for from a man named Silas McKnight." Jacob's grip tightened on his rifle. News traveled fast in small towns, but this felt different. This wasn't gossip or casual interest. This was something more purposeful, more dangerous. "I did buy a horse from McKnight. What's it to you?" Morse's smile was cold and didn't reach his eyes. "Let's just say that horse has a history, and that history includes some people who are very interested in knowing its current whereabouts. Now, I'm prepared to make you a generous offer for the animal. Say, $50. That's well above what you paid for it and considerably more than a broken-down draft horse is worth." The offer confirmed Jacob's worst fears. These men knew, or at least suspected, what Duchess really was. $50 was insulting for a horse worth thousands, but generous enough to seem legitimate if she really were just the worthless animal she appeared to be. It was a test, a way of gauging whether Jacob knew what he had. "I'm not interested in selling," Jacob said, keeping his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "I bought her fair and square, and I'm nursing her back to health. She's not for sale." Morse's expression hardened. "Everything's for sale, Mr. Mercer. It's just a question of price. Now I could go as high as $75, but that's my final offer. You'd be wise to take it." "And if I don't?" Jacob asked, though he already knew the answer. "Then you'd be making a mistake," Morse replied, his tone carrying an unmistakable threat. "A man in your position, struggling to make ends meet, owing rent, barely able to feed his animals, that's a precarious place to be. Accidents happen, properties catch fire, horses get injured or go missing. It would be a shame if any of those misfortunes befell you." The threat was clear and chilling. These weren't random horse thieves. They were organized, professional, willing to use violence and intimidation to get what they wanted. Jacob thought about Duchess, about the abuse she had already endured, about sending her back into the hands of people who had stolen and nearly destroyed her. The thought made him sick with anger. "Get off my property," he said quietly, raising the rifle just enough to make his point clear. "The horse isn't for sale, not to you or anyone else, and if you come back here threatening me or my animals, I'll defend what's mine." Morse stared at him for a long moment, clearly reassessing the situation. Finally, he smiled again, that cold, humorless expression that made Jacob's skin crawl. "You're making a mistake, Mr. Mercer, a serious mistake. But I can see you're not going to be reasonable tonight. We'll give you some time to reconsider, to think about the wisdom of choosing a worthless horse over your own well-being." The two men mounted and rode away into the darkness, leaving Jacob standing in his yard with his heart pounding and his mind racing. The situation had just become exponentially more dangerous. Jacob spent that night in his cabin with the rifle across his lap, dozing fitfully in a chair positioned where he could see both the front door and the window overlooking Duchess's paddock. Every sound made him jerk awake, heart racing, certain that Morse and his men had returned to make good on their threats. But the night passed without incident, leaving him exhausted and on edge when dawn finally broke. First light found him at Duchess's side, checking to make sure she was unharmed. The mare seemed to sense his agitation, pressing her nose against his chest in what felt like reassurance. He ran his hands over her body, checking for any signs of tampering or injury, but everything appeared normal. Still, the encounter with Morse had shaken him badly. These were not men who made idle threats, and Jacob's refusal to sell had painted a target on his back. He needed help, that much was clear, but who could he turn to? The sheriff might listen to his story, but what could he actually do? Morse and his companion hadn't broken any laws during their visit. They had made veiled threats, but nothing specific enough to warrant arrest. And if Jacob went to the authorities with the full story about Duchess's value and stolen status, he risked creating complications that might result in losing her anyway. Doc Hartley arrived mid-morning, his expression grim. Word had reached him about the visitors, news traveling through Willow Creek's efficient gossip network faster than Jacob would have thought possible. The veterinarian's concern was evident as he examined Duchess, checking her as thoroughly as Jacob had earlier. "This is worse than I thought," Doc said quietly. "If Morse is involved, this isn't just about stolen horses. The man has connections to organized crime throughout the territories. Horse theft is just one piece of a much larger operation that includes cattle rustling, property fraud, and worse. He doesn't make threats he isn't prepared to carry out." Jacob felt his stomach drop. So what am I supposed to do? Just hand her over? Let them take her back to whatever hell they had her in before? The veterinarian was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the answer. "I sent an urgent telegram to Blackwood Stables this morning, explaining the situation. I told them their mare has been located, but is in immediate danger, and that we need official documentation and possibly law enforcement involvement quickly. But Jacob, even if they respond immediately, it could be days or weeks before help arrives. In the meantime, you're exposed and vulnerable." "I'm not giving her up," Jacob said with more conviction than he felt. "Whatever it takes, I'll protect her." "Then you need allies," Doc replied. "You can't do this alone. Let me talk to some people in town, men I trust, who might be willing to help keep watch. Make sure Morse thinks twice before trying something." Over the next few days, Jacob found himself the beneficiary of an unexpected network of support. Doc Hartley had spoken to several men who had their own reasons for disliking Clayton Morse and the criminal organization he represented. Old Tom Brennan, who owned the livery stable, took to spending his evenings sitting outside Jacob's property with his shotgun, claiming he needed the fresh air. The Henderson brothers, twin ranchers known for their size and temperament, made a point of stopping by regularly, their presence alone enough to discourage casual trouble. Even Carl Henderson from the feed store, who had warned Jacob against buying Duchess in the first place, contributed by extending credit for feed, telling Jacob to pay when he could. The gesture was small but significant, a show of faith from a man who had little reason to trust in Jacob's prospects. Duchess continued to improve, despite the tension surrounding her situation. Her coat was beginning to shine with proper nutrition, the chestnut color deepening into a rich mahogany that spoke of good breeding and care. Her injured leg was healing well, the limp becoming less pronounced with each passing day. Most remarkably, her personality was emerging from beneath the trauma and abuse. She was gentle but spirited, intelligent and responsive to Jacob's commands, showing the temperament that would have made her valuable even beyond her bloodline. Jacob found himself spending hours just watching her, marveling at the transformation. This was no longer the dying animal he had impulsively traded for. This was a magnificent horse, powerful and graceful, embodying generations of careful breeding. The thought that Morse and his associates had nearly succeeded in destroying her, that they might still try to reclaim or harm her, filled him with a protective rage unlike anything he had experienced before. A week after Morse's visit, Jacob was working on fence repairs when he heard the sound of multiple horses approaching. His hand went instinctively to the rifle he now kept close at all times, but these weren't Morse's men. Doc Hartley rode at the front of a group that included Sheriff Morrison from the county seat, 2 federal marshals whose badges glinted in the afternoon sun, and a distinguished-looking man in his 50s who carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority and respect. The distinguished man dismounted first, his eyes immediately finding Duchess in her paddock. His reaction was visceral and immediate. His face went pale, his hand gripping the fence rail for support, as if his legs might not hold him. "My God," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "That's her. That's Sovereign Duchess. After all this time, after we thought we'd lost her forever." Jacob watched as the man, who introduced himself as Richard Blackwood, owner of Blackwood Stables, approached the paddock with tears streaming down his face. The mare's reaction was equally striking. She lifted her head, ears pricked forward, and released a sound that was part whinny, part cry. She moved toward the fence with the best approximation of speed her healing leg would allow, and when Blackwood reached through to touch her face, she pressed against his hand with obvious recognition and affection. The reunion was powerful enough that everyone present felt moved by it. Even the federal marshals, hardened men who had seen plenty of human tragedy, seemed affected by the clear bond between man and animal. Doc Hartley caught Jacob's eye and nodded slightly, a gesture that seemed to say this was right, this was how it should be, despite whatever complications it might bring. Richard Blackwood spent several minutes reacquainting himself with Duchess before turning to face Jacob. His expression was complex, gratitude mixed with concern, and something that looked like profound respect. "Mr. Mercer," he said, his voice still thick with emotion. "Doc Hartley has told me what you've done for her, how you traded your own resources to save her when you had no idea of her value or history. He's also told me about the threats you've faced, the danger you've put yourself in to protect her." Jacob shifted uncomfortably, unused to such direct praise. "I just did what anyone would do," he said quietly. "She needed help, and I was in a position to provide it." "Not anyone," Blackwood corrected. "Most men would have taken the money Morse offered and walked away. You chose differently, at great personal cost." The federal marshals took control of the situation with efficient professionalism. They questioned Jacob extensively about his encounter with Morse, taking detailed notes and asking for descriptions that would help them build their case. Apparently, Clayton Morse had been on their radar for years, suspected of involvement in numerous crimes across multiple territories, but evidence had always been elusive. Witnesses had a tendency to disappear or suddenly refuse to cooperate. Jacob's willingness to testify, backed by the physical evidence of Duchess herself, represented a breakthrough in their investigation. Sheriff Morrison assured Jacob that protection would be arranged, that deputies would patrol the area regularly until Morse and his associates were apprehended. The promise was reassuring, though Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that men like Morse didn't get caught easily, and that his decision to cooperate might have put him in even greater danger. Richard Blackwood watched these proceedings with a thoughtful expression, occasionally glancing toward Duchess as if reassuring himself that she was real and not some cruel dream. When the marshals finally finished their questioning, he turned his full attention to Jacob. "We need to discuss Duchess's future," he said gently, "and yours as well, if you'll permit me." Jacob felt his heart sink. He had known this moment was coming, had prepared himself for it, but the reality of losing the mare he had worked so hard to save was more painful than he had anticipated. "She's yours," he said simply. "I never claimed otherwise. I'm just glad I could help her until you found her." Blackwood smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. "Mr. Mercer, Jacob, may I call you Jacob? Duchess cannot travel in her current condition. Doc Hartley has made that abundantly clear. She needs several more weeks, possibly months of careful recovery before she can handle the journey back to Kentucky. Even then, the trip will be stressful and potentially dangerous given her recent trauma. Jacob nodded, understanding where this was leading, but not sure what Blackwood wanted from him. I'll continue to care for her as long as needed. Doc's been teaching me what to do, and I'll make sure she's ready before she has to travel. The stable owner's expression softened further. I have no doubt you would, but I have a different proposition for you. What I'm about to offer may seem unusual, but please hear me out before you respond. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Blackwood Stables has operations throughout several states, partnerships with ranches and farms, where our breeding stock are housed and cared for. We're always looking for reliable, trustworthy individuals who understand horses and can provide the kind of dedicated care our animals require. Jacob wasn't sure where this was going, but he felt a flutter of hope begin in his chest. Blackwood continued, his tone becoming more businesslike. I'd like to offer you a position as a satellite manager for Blackwood Stables. You would maintain horses here on your property, or on a property we would help you acquire, providing breeding and recovery services under our brand. We would supply the animals, the feed, the medical care, everything needed. You would provide the daily care and oversight. In return, you would receive a salary, housing allowance, and a percentage of any breeding fees or sales. The offer was so unexpected, so generous, that Jacob could barely process it. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. This would solve every problem he faced: the rent, the feed, his uncertain future. It would give him purpose, stability, a way to work with horses that went beyond simple survival. But there's more, Blackwood said. Duchess specifically. She cannot return to commercial breeding. The trauma she's experienced, both physical and psychological, makes that impossible. She deserves a peaceful retirement, a place where she's valued for herself rather than her bloodline. I'd like her to stay here with you if you're willing. She would remain my property legally, but she would be your responsibility and companion. All expenses covered by the stable, naturally. Jacob looked at Duchess, who was watching this conversation with her intelligent eyes, and felt emotion well up in his throat. He had prepared himself to lose her, to do the right thing and give her back to her rightful owner. The possibility that he might keep her, that his impulsive trade might result in not just saving her life, but sharing his life with her, seemed almost too good to be true. I don't know what to say, he managed finally. This is more than generous. It's more than I could have hoped for. You've earned it, Blackwood replied firmly. Your care saved Duchess's life. Your courage protected her from men who would have finished what they started. This isn't charity, Jacob. This is recognition of value, both hers and yours. He extended his hand. Do we have a deal? Jacob shook the offered hand, feeling the firm grip of a man who kept his promises. Yes, sir. We have a deal. The practical arrangements were worked out over the next several hours. Blackwood would purchase the property Jacob currently rented, expanding it with adjacent land to create a proper facility for housing and caring for multiple horses. He would fund the construction of a new barn, improved fencing, and living quarters that actually deserved the name. Jacob would begin receiving a monthly salary immediately, with the understanding that the first several months would be devoted primarily to Duchess's continued recovery and the property improvements. The reward money, $500, was paid out as well, though Blackwood tried to insist it wasn't necessary, given the other arrangements. Jacob accepted it gratefully, using it immediately to pay off debts and purchase supplies. The weight of financial desperation that had been crushing him for so long began to lift, replaced by something he had almost forgotten he could feel: hope for the future. As evening approached and the various officials prepared to leave, Doc Hartley pulled Jacob aside. You did good, son, the old veterinarian said quietly. Your father would be proud. You saved that mare's life, and in doing so, you saved your own in a way. Don't waste this second chance. Jacob nodded, unable to trust his voice. He watched as Blackwood said his farewells to Duchess, promising her he would return to check on her progress, speaking to her with the affection of someone who had thought he'd lost a friend and found her again against all odds. That night, after everyone had left and silence had returned to his property, Jacob sat on the fence rail watching his 3 horses. The 2 quarter horses were dozing peacefully, unaware of how dramatically their lives were about to improve. Duchess stood in her paddock, her head raised, looking out over the Montana landscape with an expression that seemed almost peaceful. She had survived theft, abuse, neglect, and nearly death itself. She had been reduced to nothing and built back up through care and determination. In many ways, her story mirrored his own. The months that followed brought changes to Jacob's life that he could scarcely have imagined during those desperate days when he had traded his last bag of feed for a dying horse. The property transformation began immediately, with construction crews arriving to build a proper barn that could house a dozen horses comfortably. The structure that rose from the Montana soil was solid and well-designed, with spacious stalls, a tack room that didn't leak, and a small office where Jacob could manage the paperwork that came with his new responsibilities. His living quarters were upgraded from the drafty cabin to a modest but comfortable house with a wood stove that actually heated the entire space and windows that didn't rattle in every wind. The luxury of these improvements felt almost decadent to a man who had grown accustomed to making do with almost nothing. But the greatest change was in Duchess herself. As winter gave way to early spring, the mare's transformation completed itself in ways that left Jacob breathless with wonder. Her coat had fully recovered, gleaming like polished mahogany in the sunlight. Her body had filled out, revealing the powerful musculature and perfect conformation that had made her valuable breeding stock. The injured leg had healed completely under Doc Hartley's expert care, and she moved with the grace and power that were her birthright. More remarkable than her physical recovery was the change in her spirit. The defeated, broken animal he had first encountered had been replaced by a horse of confidence and gentle strength. She would greet him each morning with enthusiastic whinnies, pressing her massive head against his chest in affection. She had taken to following him around the property when he let her out of the paddock, like an enormous, devoted dog, her presence both comforting and slightly comical. The 2 quarter horses had been integrated into the new barn, and the 3 animals had formed their own small herd. Jacob often found them standing together in the pasture, Duchess positioned protectively between the 2 older horses, as if she had appointed herself their guardian. The sight never failed to move him, this valuable mare who had every reason to be wary and defensive, choosing instead to offer friendship and protection to his aging companions. Richard Blackwood visited regularly, always making time to spend with Duchess, to check on her progress and to discuss the broader operations of the satellite facility. True to his word, he sent additional horses for Jacob to care for, beginning with 2 young Belgian mares who needed careful handling and training. Jacob discovered he had a gift for the work, a patience and intuition that made him excellent at rehabilitating horses with behavioral or health issues. The business grew steadily. Within 6 months, Jacob was managing 8 horses of various breeds and purposes, all connected to Blackwood stables in some capacity. The income was steady and sufficient, allowing him not just to survive, but to actually save money, to plan for a future that extended beyond the next meal or rent payment. Clayton Morse and his organization were eventually apprehended, thanks in large part to Jacob's testimony and the evidence that Duchess's recovery provided. The trial made regional news, exposing a criminal network that had been operating across multiple territories for years. Jacob had to travel to the territorial capital to testify, an experience he found nerve-wracking but necessary. Facing Morse across a courtroom, telling the story of threats and intimidation, felt like closing a chapter on the dangerous uncertainty that had defined those early weeks. The verdict was guilty on multiple counts, and Morse received a sentence that would keep him imprisoned for decades. Other members of his organization were similarly convicted, their network dismantled by law enforcement that had been building cases for years. Jacob returned home, feeling as if a weight had been lifted, knowing that Duchess and his growing operation were finally safe from that particular threat. As spring deepened into summer, Jacob found himself reflecting on the strange series of events that had brought him to this point. If he had walked past that horse trader without stopping, if he had listened to the voice of caution and common sense, if he had taken Morse's money when it was offered, his life would be completely different. He would likely still be struggling, still scraping by on odd jobs, still carrying the weight of his father's failed ranch like an anchor around his neck. Instead, he had acted on impulse and compassion, had chosen the harder path because it felt right, and that choice had opened doors he never knew existed. It wasn't just about the money or the property or the stable employment, though those things certainly mattered. It was about purpose, about waking each morning with work that felt meaningful, with animals that depended on him, with a future that held promise rather than just survival. Doc Hartley stopped by one warm evening, joining Jacob on the porch of his new house. The old veterinarian had become not just a professional consultant, but a genuine friend, someone whose wisdom and experience Jacob had come to rely on. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching Duchess graze in the pasture with the other horses, her powerful form silhouetted against the setting sun. "You know what the real miracle is," Doc said finally. "It's not that you saved her, though that's remarkable enough. It's that she saved you right back. You both needed rescuing in different ways, and somehow you found each other at exactly the right moment." Jacob considered the observation, recognizing its truth. He had been drowning in failure and despair, convinced that his life would never amount to anything beyond bitter struggle. Duchess had given him a reason to fight, a purpose that transcended his own problems, and in saving her, he had somehow found a path to saving himself. As darkness fell and stars began to appear in the vast Montana sky, Jacob called Duchess to the fence. She came immediately, her hooves thundering across the ground with the power and speed she had regained. She stopped at the fence and lowered her massive head so he could reach her more easily, breathing softly against his hand. "Thank you," he whispered, knowing she couldn't understand the words but hoping she might sense the gratitude and affection behind them. "Thank you for taking a chance on a broke cowboy who didn't know what he was doing." Duchess nickered softly in response, and Jacob smiled. The trade that had seemed so foolish, so impractical, had turned out to be the best decision of his life. He had given up a bag of feed and gained everything that mattered: purpose, security, friendship, and the profound satisfaction of knowing he had made a difference in at least one life, while that life had transformed his own beyond recognition. The prairie wind whispered through the grass around his new property, carrying with it the promise of seasons to come, of horses to be raised and cared for, of a future built on compassion rather than conquest. Jacob Mercer, the poor cowboy who had traded everything for a dying horse, had discovered what he should have known all along. Sometimes the most valuable things in life come disguised as worthless, waiting for someone with enough heart to see their true worth. And in saving Duchess, in refusing to give up on her when everyone else had, he had finally found what his father had always hoped he would discover. Not success measured in land or cattle or money, but the kind of wealth that comes from doing right by those who depend on you, from choosing compassion over convenience, from recognizing that sometimes the most practical decision is the one that follows your heart.